Well, hello, it's Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hello, John, good to see you.
Hello, sir. How are you going today?
Pretty good. How about yourself?
Pretty good.
Okay, good to hear. Now, you've been off down Melbourne way.
Yes.
And you've been looking at some interesting developments, literally.
Yes. So I was in Melbourne recently because I've been doing a series of seminars across the country about this thesis of economic Armageddon and the coming crisis. And so when I was down in Melbourne, I was there for a few days. I spent some time with the Citizens Electoral Council, Robbie Barwick, and one of the things that I'm sort of looking for now is, so some people are still skeptical about the potential coming crisis because a lot of these people say, until I see unemployment, until I see a massive spike up in terms of default and arrears, I'm not going to believe it. So this is where I've been talking to a lot of Irish immigrants who have come to Australia, but also talking to Eddie Hobbs and basically looking for early warning indicators because unemployment and the uptick in arrears, they're the things that happen at the end of the process, but there should be a whole bunch of early warning indicators that signal that this is a systemic crisis. And Eddie's been coaching me about what are those some of those signals are. So one of those signals is when you get when you get some of these new development sites that basically just collapse in terms of new sales. Now, so I got a bit of a hot tip by a confidential source about 6 weeks ago about this suburb called DonnyBrook. DonnyBrook is approximately 1 hour north of the CBD of Melbourne. And basically last year, before Christmas, they were selling in the order of maybe 18 to 25 homes a month. So regular sales in terms of new property. The development has about 5,000 properties in total. And because I've been there, it's got several stages. There's like a stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. But all of a sudden, from Christmas, the sales have completely collapsed. So I think this is quite consistent with some of the findings you found in terms of your DFA data set, how sentiment has radically changed post Christmas. So what I was told, I was shown some confidential commercial data to suggest that in the first 3 months of 2019, this suburb of DonnyBrook only sold 5 new properties, whereas before they were selling up to anywhere between 18 to 25 properties a month. So something happened here, and so I was told about this. So I said, well, while I was going to go down to Melbourne for me to do my seminar, I said to Robbie, we have to go to DonnyBrook, So I was there. So CC is based in Coburg, so we basically hopped in the car on Anzac Day. We drove up there, and we saw a lot of interesting things, and obviously it'd be sort of worthwhile to have a conversation about it.
Okay. And it's worth saying, isn't it, DonnyBrook was one of these large new development areas, so it's pretty much on pristine ground, right? And they've done a whole bunch of, as you say, phases of development, but it's all new development.
Yes, correct.
And so it's a little bit like the Joe Wilkes story on the outskirts of Auckland, right? Where you see estate after estate after estate of new development, and you ask the same questions. Well, how many of those are actually selling at the moment?
Yes. Now, one of the reasons why this sort of caught my eye, and particularly when we go later and look at some visuals of photos and videos that I took, in Ireland, where the whole country fell about 40 to 45% en masse, but where you had a large bunch of new developments in very isolated areas in the middle of nowhere, those prices fell peak to trough in the order of 70 to 80%. So obviously I thought DonnyBrook could be potentially a prime candidate. And one of the things that we should say is, as Robbie and I were driving in the car, we had a chat to you about this suburb, about the postcode. And one of the things you told us before we got to the suburb was that this particular postcode had the highest level of mortgage stress in the state of Victoria. So it was a prime candidate for some significant troubles happening there. And then after we finished being in the suburb, I showed some photos and sent them to Eddie Hobbs. And I said to Eddie, have you seen this before? He says, aha, I have seen this before. And he said, lock it in, 75 to 80% falls, peak to trough. And the interesting thing with this is a 3-bedroom house in DonnyBrook even though it's in the middle of nowhere, very, very, so it is a long, long away from Melbourne. There's no infrastructure, there's no public transport. The only way you get to your house is if you have a car, and it's a fair distance. But a 3-bedroom house, because we were looking at the average prices, is in the order of about 460,000. And a 4-bedroom house is in the order of 540,000. So if you see an 80% fall, you could be looking at 70,000, 80,000. So we're looking at very, very significant drops. If the systemic crisis happens, if we have a replay of Ireland, that is what we're talking about. And so for those that have bought into DonnyBrook with significant mortgages, because you would have borrowed maybe in the order of 400,000, 450,000. So they are still very sizable mortgages. Thinking that you wanted to get into the property market, a lot of these people could be potentially wiped out.
And we know from the most up-to-date data that land prices are falling in that area.
Yes.
And we also know that property prices have also dropped as well. So, it may not be 80% yet, but there are also already leading indicators of trouble ahead in terms of the properties are not holding their value there.
Exactly. So where I thought we would sort of take the conversation now is, so obviously I've seen a lot of videos on YouTube about Ireland, and there was a particular video that sort of struck a chord with me about 12 months ago about new developments in very isolated villages in Ireland, where one developer talked about losing, he built some new houses, and before the crash, it was about 330,000 euros he could have sold the house for. Post-crash, he only could sell it for about 80. That's a 75% price drop. So the clip goes for about 3 minutes, so how about we play that clip?
This is Shashank Bengali from McClatchy Newspapers. During the real estate bubble in Ireland, the village of Coothall, population less than 200, built 83 new homes in just a few years. In 2007, the market crashed, and now the people of Coothall are living with the consequences of that bubble. Many of the homes are still empty. Dimphna O'Regan, who's lived here all her life, says the village has changed forever.
I suppose, yes, we're one of the oldest occupants of the residents of the village. So to us it has made a huge difference, in that we're used to the beauty of the open big field there. And that was the centre of the village. And we could see the church and all from here. But that's all now. We're not able to see that, and that's a huge upset to us. But, what's here, it's here, and that's it. It's such a lovely village. We'll say nature-wise, it has the trees and the green fields and the hills and the water, and everything is really, so beautiful. It's nature at its best. And to lose some of that, or any of that is really upsetting.
In 2007, local lawyer Michael Keane bought 3 acres of land and made plans to build 32 new houses. When the bubble burst, only 8 were built, and Keane says he's lost millions.
So look, like this, we took a punt, and we it didn't work out, and it's cost me extremely dearly. I mean, one of those houses was sold there last week for 80 grand. That house would have been selling at 320, 330. It's it's painful now, I can tell you. But that's life. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Nobody forced anyone to do it. As I said, I have no time for people that are whinging and complaining that, I did this and that, the other. And the banks didn't force anybody to borrow money. People went and asked the banks for money. Maybe the banks didn't do their figures. But look, there's all parties to blame. The government made billions and billions in taxes and revenue. So nobody was going to shout stop. Do you know what I mean? In Dublin, the topic was how much is your house worth this week? You know what I mean? They were worth millions, and they were so it couldn't last. It didn't last, and the downfall is painful. But it'll be a better country for it. Overdevelopment is better than no development, and this part of the area of the country was absolutely crucified because the powers that be had no interest outside Dublin or Cork or Galway. We'll get out of this eventually. It's just going to take a long time. And unfortunately the social cost is huge.
Wow. Well, that really does tell the story, doesn't it?
Yes, yes, yeah. I mean, when you when you build houses and townhouses in an isolated area, it has a really big effect about the visuals, about the scenery, and you heard the lady talk about that. But then, obviously, once a systemic crisis occurs, and you basically don't have any interest in buying that. So one obviously is the access to finance, but when you have massive price falls, I mean, in these isolated communities, the demand for them, they are pretty much non-existent. And one of the things that I've heard from Eddie, but also from others, is there were just some areas where there were new houses where you couldn't even pay people to put in a bid. No one says, I'm not going to live in that area. So I mean, DonnyBrook could easily be a candidate where if you have a systemic collapse in terms of Victorian property, people are going to say it's just too far out of Melbourne. There's no infrastructure. There's no schools. Why would I live there? Whereas I may be able to get something a little bit more affordable closer to the city. So now, having said that, one of the things I will say is, so because there are several stages in terms of DonnyBrook, some of the early stages from what we could see seem to be well occupied, but then once you get into the more recent stages, there did seem to be a greater degree of vacant property or property that was still under construction.
And there's a couple of mechanisms there worth thinking about. Firstly, as you say, as prices slide, people can actually afford to buy closer into the city,
yes,
and get more accessible places.
Yes.
That's the first. The second is that if somebody's bought a new property a year, 18 months ago, right, and when they try to sell it, they're competing with the new prices, the new properties that are still being built, potentially now being sold at lower levels, and also a significant supply of existing properties in those new areas that are now coming back on the market again.
Yes.
So the supply side goes up, the demand drops, and prices fall. That's the mechanism we're talking about.
Precisely. So, Martin, so beyond the points you made, so I think there are a couple of new, potential new elements to sort of discuss. So obviously, we did see evidence that in the Irish situation, you had a high degree of workers, particularly construction workers from Poland, going from Poland into Ireland to help with the construction boom. So, some of them did leave once the economic conditions didn't turn out, but then from what I've been told by some Irish citizens, that some of the immigrants who stayed in Poland for more than 12 months were entitled to government benefits. So some of them stayed, but quite a few of them went. So one of the things that I saw in this suburb was a very high degree of in terms of well, I would say non-white people. So it's a lot of immigrants. So there's been a very big debate about the level of net migration coming into the country. And people are saying, well, why do we have this level of immigration coming in? There are people out there who think that this is a big debt Ponzi scheme. So if you're going to allow the banks to keep on growing and to push debt and to increase the debt bubble, you need more people who can potentially borrow. But also who can actually move into some of these places. So we saw a high number of people from the Middle East. We saw a high number of people from India who were in these suburbs, and one of the things that could happen is if you do have a systemic collapse and some of these people who have bought into this suburb, if they lose everything, kind of like what happened with the Polish in Ireland, some of them decided to go home. If you do see some immigrants saying, well, I came here for a better life, I've lost everything, I'm going back home, that's obviously going to compound the issue because, obviously if you've got less people, you've got less demand, and then property prices will fall faster. So DonnyBrook, I think, is a classic demonstration of a debt Ponzi scheme where you've got a rapid increase of population, a rapid increase in terms of the availability of credit. You get what I would call in some of my seminars about you're getting sucked in real resources into the bubble in terms of finance, construction, real estate, and once it unravels, it can quickly sort of dissipate. But a couple of the other things I saw was a lot of the property sizes. There was some of them were small, some of them were reasonable. A lot of the properties were very very tightly constructed. Not a lot of space between the properties. One of the things that Robbie was found confronting was a lot of these properties did not have a backyard. So basically, you had a block of land, you had a reasonably sized new house on there, and there wasn't any sort of availability for children to play. So obviously developers are trying to maximise the potential profit they can in terms of what they can make from a square block, whereas the more traditional suburbs of Melbourne, they do have do have a reasonable backyard, so that kids sort of could play. So obviously, when you have this type of development, it actually does impact about how people live, how you raise children, what sort of lifestyle you're going to live. And so again, it's not necessarily conducive to having children. So if you have a crisis and you've got kids and you think, well, where can I raise my kids where the kids can go out and play and have fun? You're not going to put them in the middle of nowhere where there's no backyard. So that was a couple of the other interesting observations.
One quick question. Are those plots spec build and individual spec builds, or are they being built by larger builders? Could you tell from while you were there?
So I would probably say, I think from memory, I saw both. So
right.
you see some of the big companies, but you also see a few signs here and there for individual plots. So it could well be that certain people have bought the land. It may have been a house and land package. They may be just land. People have bought them, and now either people are trying to offload that land, or trying to find someone else who may be interested in buying the land and then developing on it. But obviously we saw in the AFR last week that in terms of greenfield land defaults, it has hit a high in Melbourne of 27%. So this was I just did my seminar in Sydney, and we talked about this in the seminar, and people asked, well, what does this mean? It's basically people who have put a deposit to speculate on land. Now it comes time to settlement. They don't want to settle either because prices are falling or because they can't get finance, and they've basically said, okay, we're going to give up on the deposit, which could be $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, and just going to walk away from that. So 27% is a significant number. So in the Melbourne context, in North Melbourne, could we see some of these areas where there's a high degree of defaults? I think that's possible.
Well, I think watching some of those videos, I think Joe Wilkes would be proud because it's so similar to what we saw in and around Auckland. And of course, in and around Auckland, most of the building was private spec. So people bought a land package, basically tried to build it and then tried to sell it. So that's going bad over there. I suspect it will be the same here. And if you take into account the number of new properties still being built, partly built, the lack of amenities in the area, the difficulty now of getting finance, right, the falling prices, you get the sense, I think, that this is the start of something more significant, and actually is almost, it becomes a social problem, right?
Yes.
Because effectively, so many things go wrong at the same time in the same area.
Yes. So definitely, I would agree with that. When we went to DonnyBrook, and I posted a particular picture of a row of townhouses that were empty, I said this is the epicenter of the Armageddon, because you're going to see a lot of big falls, a lot of people who get wiped out, and you could see a high level of empty houses in terms of vacancies. So I think suburbs like DonnyBrook are a classic example of systemic public policy failure. You're going to have a massive economic horror. You're going to have a huge social cost. And we obviously heard in the Irish video the gentleman about his village talk about there is a massive social cost when all of this falls apart. And now, while I was in Melbourne, I didn't have the opportunity to travel to other parts of Melbourne, but having spoken to some of the locals, they've said DonnyBrook, this is happening in southeast Melbourne, but also in terms of the western suburbs. So it's not just the northern part of Melbourne that is seeing this behaviour. It's all the same. And all you need to say in terms of Sydney, southwest Sydney, northwest Sydney, northwest Sydney, as in Box Hill, that recently got some TV coverage. It is the same sort of behaviour. Yeah,
and it's consistent with my mortgage stress analysis more broadly, that the highest levels of mortgage stress are in areas where there's been a lot of recent development. Most of it's on small lots. Most of it's new build, right? And what's interesting is that these are not necessarily the least wealthy people. They're often a little bit more wealthy than average in some cases. They've paid more than average for what they've bought.
Yes.
And they've got very large mortgages, often around 90% or more. And of course, that means you've got all the pressures of negative equity and all those things too.
Yeah.
And there's such a consistent pattern that we're seeing in multiple geographies in the urban rings around our major centres, that you can see that this is, DonnyBrook's one example. We shouldn't think that it's the only example of precisely the same issues that we can see again and again.
Mm-mm. So one of the people who I had the chance to have a chat with while I was in Melbourne have some contacts who have bought into DonnyBrook, but also in that broader area like Craigieburn, etc. And what I was told was that particularly among the immigrant population, they have very little knowledge about the state of the market, very little knowledge about economics, what the banks were really up to, and a lot of them have bought on a false set of assumptions, and so once this crisis comes out and a lot of these people lose their life savings in these properties, there is a lot of pain to be felt, and so in terms of the title of the episode, Heaven Help the Poor Souls of DonnyBrook, I think DonnyBrook's going to be, you may probably see it on Four Corners or the 7:30 Report in the next 2 years of one of these suburbs where a lot of people just got completely wiped out.
So, John, one of the questions which sort of jumps out at me is, if we've got all these pressures in the area, how does that translate back into the employment context?
Sure. So one of the things I've been saying in some of my seminars about what is economic Armageddon, and I've said it consistently, it's not, and I think I said this several times last year with you, it's not that prices fall, it's when people can't pay the mortgages,
Yep.
And you have a systemic financial issue, particularly once it affects the banks. So how can that sort of manifest itself? It's either a raise in interest rates, or a shock to incomes, a shock to expenses. Shock to expenses could be, for example, an increase in petrol, an increase in other costs like electricity or childcare, but a shock to income. So one of the things I've said in my seminars is the definition of employment, it is only 1 hour a week. So you don't necessarily need people to be unemployed for them to be in trouble in terms of their mortgages. But obviously, if property sales in suburbs like DonnyBrook have collapsed and that appears to be the case, well, people involved in the construction sector, the finance sector, the real estate sector, etc., they will have less work. Maybe they'll find work elsewhere. So they don't necessarily technically have to be unemployed because the Reserve Bank says we still have a very low rate of unemployment. But even if, so what I suspect you may have seen is some of these construction workers working in these new development sites, at the peak they may have had 6 days work a week. They had a very high level of income. They made financial debt obligation commitments based on that level of high income. And now if they've had their hours reduced and they're working maybe 3 days rather than 6 days, that could be sufficient for them to be in trouble in terms of servicing their debt. So I think the Armageddon that I think see coming, now we see it playing out more quickly. It could be that we're going to have more people having problems with their jobs, either unemployment or loss of bonuses, or loss of hours, and that will start to manifest itself into more the mortgage stress that you see, then transforming into more arrears and more defaults.
Yes, and I think the critical question is not necessarily unemployment, but underemployment, right?
Yes.
And underemployment is extremely high in Australia, and it's really
8%.
Yeah, it's really hardly dropping at all.
Yes.
And indeed, some other metrics would be even higher than that. So we have a very large number of households today that have multiple part-time jobs, right, and are not earning the hours that they would want to earn in. So they're already under pressure. And it doesn't take much to slide them over from essentially not being able to manage all of their debts.
Yeah, correct.
So unfortunately, it's all part of that sliding slope towards effectively defaulting.
Yeah.
John, it's a very worrying time for many people, and I think it's important that we bring these, examples to the wider public.
Absolutely.
So that people get what's really going on, because the mainstream media is still not telling the truth about what's actually happening in the property sector.
100%.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
See you next time. So there you have it. A really troubling episode, I think. But Unfortunately, as we said, we don't expect this to be the only area impacted, and unfortunately more and more suburbs will be going the same way. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people.